My name is Tessa Moore. I'm 65 years old, a retired art teacher from Savannah, and the widow of a man who believed dignity was the last thing a person should ever give away. I used to think I'd learned enough about human nature from my students and my paintings, but I was wrong. The lesson that would change everything began on a night filled with chandeliers, laughter, and the kind of smiles that hurt more than silence. If you've ever been told to apologize for something you didn't do, just to keep the peace, you might understand why I'm telling this story. And if you've ever swallowed your pride to protect someone you love, stay with me. What I learned about truth and grace might speak to you too. That night, the ballroom in Vivian Harlan's mansion shimmered like a magazine spread. She was my daughter-in-law's mother, a woman whose charity events were as famous as her wardrobe. Crystal glasses lined the tables, and the air smelled of money and perfume. I didn't want to be there, but Daniel, my only son, had insisted. "Mom, it's her birthday. Don't make it awkward," he'd said, straightening his expensive watch. Vivian spotted me the moment I walked in. Her voice floated through the crowd like champagne bubbles, sweet but biting. "Tessa, dear, how lovely of you to come. You found something elegant to wear, I see." The room chuckled, and my hands found the edge of my blue scarf. I smiled politely and said, "It's old, but it's honest." For a heartbeat, you could hear the air shift. Then the laughter returned, directed somewhere else. I stood near the dessert table, watching Daniel laugh too loudly at something Vivian said. He looked uncomfortable, as if trying to prove he belonged. I felt that ache only a mother knows, the kind that burns and forgives at the same time. When the speeches began, Vivian raised her glass. "To family," she said, her diamonds catching the light. "Especially those who remind us where we came from and how far we've come since." Everyone clapped. Her eyes lingered on me as if she were delivering a sermon. Later that night, outside the mansion, the air smelled of rain and exhaust. Daniel followed me to my car. "Mom," he said, his jaw tight, "you need to apologize to Vivian." I stared at him, thinking he must be joking. "For what?" I asked, and "You embarrassed her in front of everyone. She's been generous to us, and you made her feel small." The irony was painful. "Daniel," I said softly, "respect doesn't shrink when truth stands near it." But he didn't hear me. His eyes darted away, somewhere between guilt and fear. "If you don't apologize," he said, "maybe it's better if you stay away for a while." There was a long silence, the kind that fills your lungs with cold air and makes your heart choose between pride and love. I finally said, "All right, Daniel." He nodded, relieved, and walked back toward the house. The red taillights from valet cars flashed across his face, making him look like someone I didn't recognize. I sat in my car for a while, gripping the steering wheel. I wasn't angry yet, just hollow. I watched the mansion glow behind me, every window bright, every shadow soft. Vivian's world was made of light, but it blinded more than it illuminated. On the drive home, the sound of my tires on wet asphalt was the only rhythm in the night. I thought about the years I'd spent teaching students how to paint light and shadow. I used to say, "The darker the background, the more the light matters." It occurred to me that maybe people weren't so different. When I got home, I hung my scarf on the chair by the window. It still smelled faintly of my late husband's cologne. He used to tell me, "Never trade truth for comfort, Tess. Comfort fades faster." I whispered his words out loud, as if saying them could summon his calm. The next morning, I woke early. Daniel hadn't called. My breakfast went untouched. I looked out at the garden he used to help me tend when he was a boy. There was a time when he'd dig holes too wide for the flowers, afraid they wouldn't have enough room to grow. Now it seemed he was the one buried under someone else's expectations. A soft ping from my phone broke the quiet. A message from Emily, my daughter-in-law. "Mom, Vivian said she'd appreciate a personal visit. It would mean a lot to Daniel, too." Her tone was polite, distant. The word stung, but I typed back, "Tell her I'll come tomorrow afternoon." I spent the rest of the day preparing the way I used to before parent-teacher conferences. Quietly, deliberately, I polished my shoes, pressed my blouse, and folded my blue scarf. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was planning composure. That evening, as the sun set behind the oak trees, I walked to the porch with a cup of tea. The ticking of the old wall clock echoed through the house. It reminded me of Daniel's watch, the one Vivian had given him after their first Christmas together. Time had a cruel way of reminding us who owned what. I thought about how strange it felt, being asked to apologize for something I hadn't done. I wondered if humility meant surrender or if it could mean something else, something stronger. Maybe an apology could hold power if spoken at the right moment, with the right truth behind it. When I finally went inside, I saw the blue scarf draped over the chair again. The moonlight made it glow faintly, like a small piece of courage waiting to be worn. I smiled. Maybe I would apologize after all, but not the way they expected. I didn't know it yet, but the next words I'd speak inside that mansion would echo longer than Vivian's wealth, louder than her parties, and deeper than her pride. Sometimes, silence sharpens truth until it cuts clean. And sometimes, one apology can end an entire illusion. The morning after Daniel demanded that apology, I sat at the small kitchen table where sunlight always fell across the same spot, warming my cup, but not my hands. The air felt heavy with things unspoken. I told myself that my son's voice had been tired, that the words he used weren't really his own. Mothers have a habit of rewriting the truth until it hurts less. I remembered when Daniel used to visit every Sunday after church. He'd bring a carton of takeout and ask if I needed help fixing anything around the house. The boy who once stayed up late, writing lesson plans at the kitchen counter, was gone, replaced by a man who spoke in borrowed phrases about promotion, clients, and image. Somewhere along the way, the quiet honesty I'd raised him with had been traded for polished manners and the subtle fear of not belonging. There's a saying my husband used to repeat whenever Daniel got frustrated as a teenager: "A good heart never needs to shout." It was true then. It's still true now. But Daniel had married into a world that measured worth by noise. Fundraisers, speeches, press releases, applause. Silence in that world was weakness. I opened an old album while my tea cooled. The first photo showed Daniel at his wedding, his smile unguarded, his hand trembling slightly as he slipped the ring on Emily's finger. It had been a simple ceremony in a small garden. Vivian hadn't approved. She'd called it quaint, the kind of word that sounds polite until you feel its edge. After the ceremony, she invited everyone to her estate for what she called a real celebration. I hadn't wanted to go, but Daniel insisted. "She means well," he said, adjusting the cuffs of his rented tux. "She just likes things big." Back then, Emily still had the gentle air of a woman trying to please two worlds at once. She sat beside me at the dinner table, whispering small talk about her work and the students she once tutored before her mother insisted she stop. "Vivian says people talk if a Harlan takes jobs like that," she told me, lowering her voice. I remember smiling and saying, "Some of the most beautiful lives are built quietly." She nodded, but her eyes carried the unease of someone already living on borrowed freedom. After Daniel married her, the visits home became shorter. He started dressing like her father, talking like her mother, and laughing at things that didn't sound funny. I tried to tell myself that change was natural, that love reshapes people. But I also knew what control sounded like. It never shouted. It simply rearranged the air around you until breathing felt like permission. When Daniel got a job at Vivian's company, he called me with pride. "Mom, can you believe it? She trusts me with her foundation's accounts. It's a big step." I congratulated him, but a strange chill settled in my stomach. I'd read too many stories of families tangled in money they didn't earn. He brushed it off when I mentioned it. "It's all clean, Mom. Vivian runs a charity. We're helping people." Months later, when I visited, Vivian made a show of generosity. "You raised a fine son," she told me, sipping her wine. "He just needed the right environment to shine." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Daniel beamed anyway, proud like a boy who'd finally earned approval. I wanted to tell him that approval built on hierarchy isn't love, but he looked happy, and I bit my tongue. Now, sitting at my kitchen table years later, I could see how that night had planted the first seed of distance between us. Love became loyalty, and loyalty became debt. I wondered how many of Vivian's gifts came with invisible strings. The phone rang, snapping me back to the present. It was Emily. "Mom," she began softly. "Daniel's worried you're upset." Her voice wavered, caught between compassion and caution. "Vivian didn't mean to sound unkind. You know how she is about appearances." "I know," I said, keeping my tone even. "Tell Daniel I'll come tomorrow to apologize." She hesitated. "That means a lot to him. He feels caught between—" She stopped herself. I finished her sentence in my head. Between love and loyalty. After the call, I walked through the small studio where I still painted sometimes. Canvases leaned against the wall. Unfinished skies. Half-drawn hands. The outline of a woman looking away. I thought about art as truth that refuses to explain itself. Maybe this apology could be the same. Something unfinished but revealing. That afternoon, I drove into town to buy flowers. The florist asked who they were for. "Someone who needs to believe they've already won," I said before I could stop myself. She smiled politely and wrapped the bouquet in paper the color of ash. On the drive home, I passed the school where I'd once taught. The playground was empty, the swings moving slightly in the breeze. I thought of Daniel as a boy again, the way he'd run to me with scraped knees and a proud grin, insisting he didn't cry. Back then, I believed love alone could protect him. I didn't realize how easily love can turn into armor for someone else's battle. That night, as I prepared for bed, I took the blue scarf from the chair and draped it around my neck. The fabric brushed against my skin like memory. I looked in the mirror and thought about the woman I used to be. Certain, steady, untested. Tomorrow, I would walk into that mansion not as a guest, but as a mirror. I knew what Vivian expected. Submission disguised as grace. She'd hear an apology shaped to her world, wrapped in the same politeness she weaponized. But beneath it, she'd hear something she couldn't control. I sat on the edge of my bed, whispering the words that had once guided me through every storm. A quiet truth can still move mountains. I didn't know if it was courage or exhaustion, but the thought steadied me. Before turning off the light, I picked up a framed photo of Daniel and Emily from the night they got engaged. His arm was around her, her head tilted toward him, both of them unaware of the future waiting between them. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb and said quietly, You'll find your way back, my son. Just not yet. The house fell silent except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Each second felt like a reminder that time keeps its own kind of mercy. It lets the truth wait until people are ready to see it. When I finally lay down, I didn't dream of apologies or confrontation. I dreamed of the sea, calm and endless, the kind of stillness that hides 1,000 stories beneath it. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the beginning of an apology that wasn't really an apology at all. The next evening arrived wrapped in the faint chill of early spring. I drove toward the Harlan mansion with the bouquet of pale lilies on the seat beside me. Their scent filled the car, sweet but sharp, the kind of smell that fades quickly but lingers in memory. I had told myself it was just a dinner, just an apology, just words. But deep down, I knew the moment I stepped through those doors, nothing would ever be just anything again. Vivian's estate rose at the edge of the marshlands, its white pillars reflected in the pond like a portrait of its owner, perfect from afar, cold up close. Cars lined the long driveway, black and shining. I parked near the gate and took a breath before walking in. The sound of laughter floated from the terrace, high and rehearsed. Inside, the house smelled of roses, candles, and control. Daniel met me in the foyer. He looked relieved but nervous, like a man standing between two storms. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said. "It'll mean a lot to everyone." His hand brushed the Rolex on his wrist, a small movement I'd begun to notice more often than his smile. Emily appeared behind him, her expression soft but distant. "You look lovely," she said, her voice careful. I could tell she'd spent the afternoon helping her mother prepare the show. Her dress shimmered under the chandelier, expensive fabric hiding a tremor in her hands. Vivian entered like a performer making her cue. "Tessa," she said, stretching the syllables like ribbon. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would," I answered. She smiled. "Good. Dinner's almost ready. I want it tonight to feel civil." Civil was her word for domination. The dining room was set for 12, though only 8 seats were filled. Every place setting gleamed, the silverware aligned with mathematical precision. The walls carried portraits of Vivian at various ages, each one a monument to her own story. As we sat, a waiter poured wine into delicate glasses. Vivian lifted hers and began. "To family, to forgiveness, and to knowing our place in the world." The guest smiled obediently. Daniel clinked his glass with hers, and I felt the hollow sound echo in my chest. Conversation drifted toward the usual topics: philanthropy, investments, who had recently bought what. Then one woman turned to me and asked with a saccharine tone, "Tessa, I heard you used to teach art at the community college. That must have been fulfilling." The pause before the last word carried a knife's edge. I smiled. "It was. There's beauty in teaching people who can't afford galleries." Vivian's eyes flickered toward me. "Of course, charity has its own charm," she said, her voice smooth. "Though, as I always say, real impact comes from people who can give, not those who need." The laughter was polite, restrained, but it landed like a slap. I looked down at my plate, tracing the rim with my fingertip. My scarf brushed the tablecloth, and for a moment, I imagined my husband's voice. "Don't defend yourself. Let the silence defend you." But silence doesn't always shield dignity. Sometimes it becomes the weapon others use against you. So I lifted my head and said quietly, "You're right, Vivian. It's easier to give when you've never known need, but the heart remembers what the hands forget." The room froze. forks paused midair. Someone coughed softly. The chandelier hummed with electricity. And for the first time that night, Vivian had no words. Her painted smile faltered, just enough for me to see the crack beneath. Then, like an actress remembering her script, she clutched her chest and sighed. "Oh, I think the wine's too strong," she murmured, leaning against Emily. "These dinners take so much energy." Guests rushed to comfort her, murmuring sympathy. Daniel looked panicked, his hand on her shoulder. "Mom," he whispered to me. "What did you do?" I looked at him steadily. I told the truth. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to Vivian, who now had one hand pressed dramatically against her pearls. The performance was complete. I stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. Around me, the table buzzed with confusion. As I stepped back from the commotion, I noticed Olivia, the longtime housekeeper, standing near the corner, half hidden behind a curtain. Her eyes met mine for a second, full of something I couldn't yet name. She held a small tray, but her other hand rested inside the pocket of her apron, still. I gave her a faint nod before turning away. I left the dining room unnoticed, walking through the hallway lined with mirrors. Each reflection showed a different version of me. Guest, outsider, mother, witness. The wall seemed to whisper, "Apologize, Tessa. Apologize." Outside, the night had turned heavy with humidity. The air clung to my skin as I crossed the porch. Heading toward the car, I paused by the garden, looking back at the bright windows. Laughter resumed inside, forced and brittle. Vivian was back on stage, surrounded by her audience. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Daniel's face. The confusion, the fear, the way his loyalty twisted against his better self. Love could make a man bend until he forgot where he stood. I thought about Emily too, her silence louder than the music that played from the house. When I reached home, I placed the lilies in a vase by the window. Their petals had already started to bruise at the edges. I wondered if truth worked the same way, fragile at first, then inevitable. I made a cup of tea and sat in the dark, letting the quiet stretch. The ticking clock filled the room again. I thought about Olivia's eyes, watching from the corner. There was recognition in them, a flicker of conscience. Something told me that night hadn't ended with Vivian's performance. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Be careful what you say tomorrow. Some things are not what they seem." There was no name attached, but I knew the voice behind the words. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I looked out the window at the streetlight flickering on the corner, its glow bending through the glass like a trembling heartbeat. For the first time since the dinner began, I felt something sharp under the calm. Not anger, awareness. I didn't know exactly what game Vivian was playing yet, but I understood one thing clearly. The rules were written in silence, and silence was her weapon. I was going to learn to turn it against her. The lilies in the vase leaned toward the light, fragile but still upright. I whispered to them, "We'll see who wilts first." Then I turned off the lamp and let the house fall back into stillness. The next afternoon, clouds hung low over Savannah, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it. I drove to the Harlan mansion once more, this time not for a dinner, but for what Vivian called a private apology. The words had the texture of velvet wrapped around steel. I brought no flowers, only the blue scarf around my neck and the calm that comes when anger has burned itself clean. The housekeeper, Olivia, met me at the door. Her eyes flickered, cautious but kind. "Mrs. Harland is expecting you in the east drawing room," she said quietly. I nodded, catching the faint tremor in her voice. Something about her demeanor told me she didn't agree with what was about to happen. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and roses. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of Vivian at galas, ribbon cuttings, and award ceremonies. Each frame was a monument to self-admiration. I walked slowly, letting my hand trail along the edge of the polished wainscoting. The walls seemed to hum with secrets. From the drawing room came the faint echo of conversation. Vivian's sharp tone, Emily's softer reply, and then Daniel's voice, low and uncertain. I paused near the doorway. Vivian's words carried like perfume. She needs to understand boundaries, Emily. Publicly embarrassing someone of my standing is not something I can overlook. I know, Mother, Emily said, though her tone wavered. She didn't mean to. Vivian cut her off. Intentions are irrelevant. Perception is everything. The sound of a watch clicking broke the tension. Daniel's Rolex. He murmured something I couldn't catch. I stepped inside before they could continue. Vivian turned toward me with the kind of smile people wear when cameras are near. Tessa, dear, I was just telling Emily how gracious it is of you to come. I gave my word, I said. Daniel looked relieved but uneasy. He gestured toward the sofa. Mom, let's just get this over with, all right? It'll smooth everything out. Vivian waved a manicured hand. Tea, Olivia, she ordered without looking. Olivia nodded and disappeared through a side door. I sat down across from her. The room was staged perfectly. Fresh flowers, polished silver, a photograph of Vivian shaking hands with a senator. It smelled of power and control. Vivian crossed her legs and studied me. I understand you value honesty, she began, her tone practiced. So let's be honest. You embarrassed me, Tessa, in front of people whose opinions matter. I built my reputation on grace, and last night, you questioned that. I'm sure you didn't mean harm, but these things spread. Her eyes gleamed. If you simply acknowledge it, we can move on. I met her gaze. You mean if I say what you need to hear? She smiled, thin and victorious. Call it mutual understanding. Before I could respond, Olivia returned with the tea tray. As she poured, her hand brushed the cup just slightly, leaving a faint tremor in the saucer. When she set the tray down, she glanced at me, briefly, intentionally, and then slipped a small folded napkin beneath my cup. Her face betrayed nothing. Vivian didn't notice. She was too busy talking about reputation, charity, and appearances. I lifted my cup, pretending to sip. Beneath it, I unfolded the napkin with one hand. In small, careful handwriting, it read, "Be careful." Mr. Tate called again. Something about accounts. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. It was the kind of stillness I'd felt before grading final exams, the quiet before decisions changed futures. Vivian leaned forward. So, shall we? I set the cup down. I've always believed apologies mean something only when they're mutual, I said. Otherwise, they're just scripts. Her smile stiffened. I'm afraid you misunderstand how society works. Daniel's voice broke in. Mom, please. Just say you're sorry. Vivian's trying to make peace. I looked at him. Is that what you think this is? Peace? He shifted uncomfortably. The Rolex ticked again, faint but rhythmic. Time had become her ally, binding him in gold and guilt. Vivian rose and walked toward the window. Daniel, perhaps you should step outside. Let us women talk. He hesitated but obeyed, leaving the room. Emily stayed behind, standing near the doorway like a shadow torn between loyalties. Vivian turned back to me. Your son is a good man, she said, but he lacks ambition. I've given him opportunities your life could never offer. You should be grateful, not resentful. I tilted my head. Gratitude doesn't mean obedience. Obedience? She repeated, as if tasting the word. No, dear. Cooperation, harmony. You wouldn't understand. You've never had to manage people, build something lasting. On the contrary, I said softly, I built a life that didn't require applause to exist. Something flickered in her eyes, annoyance, maybe even fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but Olivia returned again, this time carrying a phone. Mrs. Harland, she said. Mr. Tate is on the line. Vivian frowned. Tell him I'm busy. He said it's urgent, Olivia replied. Something about the foundation's transfers. Vivian's face tightened. Later, she snapped. Olivia nodded and left, but not before giving me a quick look. A silent exchange that said, You heard enough. When the door closed, Vivian exhaled sharply. Honestly, the incompetence these people display. Emily spoke up then, her voice barely above a whisper. Mother, maybe this isn't the best time. Vivian turned on her. Emily, please, let the adults handle adult matters. I rose from my seat. You're right, Vivian, I said. This isn't the best time, but don't worry. I'll make sure my apology finds the right audience. She smiled, misinterpreting my calm as defeat. That's all I ask. As I turned to leave, Emily reached out. Tessa, she said quietly, I didn't know she'd push it this far. I touched her hand gently. It's all right, dear. Sometimes people push until they fall. Outside, I found Daniel pacing near the fountain. Did she forgive you? He asked quickly. I looked at him, the man who used to fix broken birdhouses with me in the backyard. She accepted what she needed to hear, I said. He nodded, not realizing what I meant. Good. Maybe now things can settle down. As I walked to my car, I could hear the faint ticking again, softer now, like the heartbeat of a clock winding down. The clouds above finally began to break, releasing a drizzle that blurred the mansion's lights into hazy halos. When I started the engine, I took the folded napkin from my pocket and placed it on the dashboard. The ink had smudged slightly, but the words were still clear. Be careful. I didn't yet know what Mr. Tate's call meant, but I knew this. Vivian's empire of grace had cracks, and somewhere behind those polished walls, something rotten was beginning to surface. When I returned home that evening, the house greeted me with its familiar stillness. The scent of old wood and lavender hung in the air, and the faint ticking of the clock marked the seconds like careful footsteps. I slipped off my shoes and placed my scarf on the chair by the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening, each blade of grass holding a drop of light. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. I made a cup of tea, but instead of drinking it, I sat with the steam rising and curling toward the window pane. The folded napkin with Olivia's warning lay beside me. I ran my finger over the faint handwriting, the ink slightly faded from moisture. Be careful, it said, nothing more. But sometimes the smallest words carry the heaviest truth. On the corner shelf sat a small wooden box I hadn't opened in years. My late husband, Robert, had carved it himself, its lid etched with the image of a magnolia blossom. Inside were mementos of a quieter time. Our wedding photo, a dried rose, and a few old letters wrapped in ribbon. I opened the bundle and found one envelope I didn't remember seeing before. The handwriting was his, steady, unmistakable. The letter began simply, If you're reading this, Tess, I'm probably gone. But I know you. You'll keep everything together, even when the world tries to pull it apart. Promise me one thing. Never mistake silence for surrender. Wear something that reminds you who you are. I smiled faintly, a lump catching in my throat. At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, was the scarf he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, a soft shade of blue, worn at the edges. He used to say the color reminded him of the ocean at dawn, calm but deep. I lifted it to my face and breathed in the faint scent of cedar that lingered from the box. Wear something that reminds you who you are. His words echoed in my mind as I tied the scarf around my neck. It wasn't just fabric. It was memory woven into thread. A knock sounded at the door. I knew it would be Daniel before I even opened it. He stood there, rain still clinging to his jacket, his expression drawn tight. "Mom, can we talk?" I nodded and stepped aside. He paced the small living room, his eyes restless. "Vivian told me what happened," he said. "She said you were difficult again." "Difficult," I repeated softly, tasting the word. "That's one way to describe integrity." He sighed. "Mom, please. I'm trying to keep peace here. You don't understand the kind of pressure she's under." "And what kind of pressure are you under, Daniel?" He looked away. "She's helping us, me and Emily. The company, her foundation, it's growing fast. There's talk of an expansion, new donors. She trusts me with the accounts, Mom. This is my chance." "Your chance at what?" "To finally be someone," he said quietly. I felt my heart tighten. "You've always been someone, Daniel. You just stopped believing it was enough." He didn't answer. The Rolex on his wrist caught the lamplight, its ticking filling the silence between us. I remembered when his father gave him his first watch at 16. It was simple, leather-banded, modest. Now, this gleaming thing on his wrist looked like a chain disguised as a gift. "Vivian says you'll be at the gala next week," he said. "She's planning a moment for you to make things right publicly." "Publicly," I said. "That word again." He frowned. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at him, really looked. The weariness behind the confidence, the way his jaw tensed when he spoke her name. My son was trapped, and he didn't even see the bars. "Daniel," I said gently, "when you hear your watch tick, what do you feel?" He blinked. "What?" "The sound. Does it calm you or remind you who wound it last?" He stared at me, confused, maybe even a little frightened by the question. I stepped closer and rested my hand on his arm. "You're chasing her world, but she built it on quicksand. Don't let her convince you to stand still while you sink." He shook his head, stepping back. "You don't know her, Mom. She's not the monster you think she is." "No," I said softly. "She's worse, because she makes good people believe they owe her their souls." His eyes flashed with hurt. "I came here hoping you'd apologize. I didn't come for this." "Then maybe you should leave before I say something true." For a moment, he looked like the boy I once knew, lost and frightened by his own reflection. Then he turned, muttered something I couldn't catch, and left. The door closed behind him with the kind of finality that leaves the air aching. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain starting again. Then I went to the table and unfolded Robert's letter once more. "Wear something that reminds you who you are." I went to the mirror and looked at my reflection. The scarf lay against my neck like a promise. I whispered, "All right, love. I'll remember." That night, I wrote in my journal, a habit I'd abandoned after Robert's death. I wrote not about anger, but about clarity, about how silence can hold power if it's chosen, not forced. I wrote about Daniel, about how love sometimes means stepping back so someone can see the cliff they're walking toward. Before bed, I folded the napkin from Olivia and placed it inside the wooden box beside Robert's letter. The box closed with a soft click, like the sealing of intent. As I turned off the lamp, the scarf's shadow stretched across the room, long and calm. I lay down, knowing that tomorrow I would begin something careful, deliberate, and silent. Vivian wanted an apology. I would give her one, but it would be written in truth, not submission. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Soft but certain, some storms don't need to roar to change the air. Morning light broke through the curtains like water slipping past stone. I woke before the alarm, the blue scarf still draped around my neck. The air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine from the garden outside. I made tea, but it grew cold untouched as I sat at the kitchen table thinking about Olivia's note and Robert's letter. Between them, truth and warning had found each other. By the time the clock struck 9, I had made my decision. The kind of decision that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything once spoken aloud. I picked up the phone and called Mark Ellis, my late husband's old friend and the only man I trusted with numbers. His voice came warm and steady on the line, the same as it had been 20 years ago when he helped Robert close the books on his small business. "Tessa," he said, "I didn't expect to hear from you this early." "I need your help, Mark," I said, "and your discretion. It's about a charity called Harland Hope." There was a pause. "I've heard the name, big donor circuit. What about it?" "I think something's wrong," I said. "And I think my son is caught in it." He exhaled, the sound of a man who understood more than he said. "All right. I can look into their filings. You'll need to get me access to internal transfers or donor reports, quietly." "I might have someone who can help," I said. When we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long moment before scrolling through my messages. Olivia's number wasn't saved, but the last message she'd sent flashed in my mind. "Be careful." I typed slowly. "Can we meet somewhere private? I need to ask you something." Her reply came within a minute. "Church courtyard. Noon. Alone." At noon, I parked near St. Mary's Church, a quiet brick building surrounded by magnolia trees. The bells had just finished ringing when I saw Olivia sitting on a bench near the fountain. She wore her uniform still, as if afraid to be seen without it. "Thank you for coming," I said, taking a seat beside her. She kept her eyes on the water. "Mrs. Moore, if they find out I spoke to you—" "They won't," I said softly. "But if what you know could hurt innocent people, you can't stay silent." Her hands twisted the edge of her apron. "Mrs. Harland isn't what she seems. The charity, the donations, they don't all go where she says they do. Some accounts move money overseas. Others fund her private projects. The transfers go through your son's department." I felt my stomach tighten. "Does Daniel know?" "I don't think so," she said quickly. "He believes it's all above board. But her lawyer, Mr. Tate, he knows. He handles the paperwork." She glanced around and then slipped something from her pocket. A small USB drive, wrapped in tissue. I copied some files from the office computer, transactions, donor lists, audio from a call she made with Mr. Tate. I shouldn't have done it, but someone has to stop her. I reached for her hand and closed it around mine. "You did the right thing." As she rose to leave, I asked, Why help me? She hesitated. Because, once, she ruined someone I loved. I didn't speak up then. I won't make that mistake again. She walked away without looking back. I sat there for a while, the USB heavy in my palm. The fountain gurgled softly beside me, a steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock. That evening, I met Mark at his small office downtown. He was a man who believed in paper trails more than promises. His desk was stacked with folders, ledgers, and calculators older than my son. He took the USB and plugged it into his computer, the screen lighting his face in pale blue. For nearly an hour, neither of us spoke. The sound of typing and quiet breathing filled the room. Finally, Mark leaned back in his chair. "She's laundering donation money through shell organizations," he said. "It looks clean on the surface. Charitable transfers, consulting fees. But the routing numbers repeat. Classic pattern." "And Daniel?" He frowned. "His name's on a few authorizations, but nothing direct. My guess is he's signing what she gives him without reading closely. She's using him to make it look legitimate." I closed my eyes. "Can we prove it?" Mark nodded. "Easily, but if this goes public, it won't just hurt her. It'll drag him down too." "I know," I said. "That's why it has to be handled carefully. No police, not yet. We let her own arrogance expose her." He smiled faintly. "You've still got Robert's sense of strategy." "Robert would have wanted me to protect Daniel," I said. "And maybe teach Vivian what real accountability looks like." When I left his office, the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender. I drove home in silence, replaying every word, every image. Vivian's laughter at the dinner table, Daniel's wristwatch catching the light, Olivia's trembling hands. They all felt connected now, threads weaving towards something inevitable. At home, I poured myself a small glass of wine and opened my notebook. I drew 3 columns: truth, proof, timing, and under each, I began to write. I didn't need to fight her openly. I only needed to let the truth find the right moment to breathe. When Daniel called later that night, his tone was eager. "Mom, Vivian says she wants you to come to brunch tomorrow. She wants to put this whole thing behind us." I could almost hear Vivian's voice behind his. "Tell her I'll be there," I said. "Thank you, Mom," he said, relief softening his words. "You'll see. She's not so bad once you get to know her." "I'm sure I will," I said, my hand brushing the blue scarf. After we hung up, I went to my study and slipped the USB into a small envelope. On the front, I wrote in neat letters, "For Reverend Cole, keep safe." He had always been Robert's confidant, the kind of man who understood the weight of truth better than most lawyers ever could. I'd drop it by his office tomorrow, just in case. Before going to bed, I looked out the window toward the horizon where the city lights blurred against the dark. Tomorrow, I would walk back into Vivian's world. I would smile, I would apologize, and I would mean every word, but not the way she thought, because sometimes silence is the sharpest tool in the box. And the moment you let people believe they've silenced you, that's when the truth begins to speak louder than ever. The morning of the so-called brunch arrived soft and bright, as if the world had chosen irony for a color. Birds flitted across the garden fence, and sunlight spilled onto the breakfast table. I watched the light crawl across the blue scarf draped over my chair and thought about how calm the world could look right before it changed. Before I left, I stopped by Reverend Cole's small office behind the church. The old oak door creaked as I pushed it open. He looked up from his desk, his eyes kind and clear. "Tessa," he said with a smile, "it's been a long time." I placed the envelope on his desk. "Keep this for me. I said. If anything ever happens, make sure Mark Ellis gets it. He studied me for a moment, understanding without needing details. Truth has its own timing, he said quietly. It always comes home. I'm counting on that, I said, and left before the calm in my voice could falter. The brunch at Vivian's mansion felt less like reconciliation and more like theater. The table sparkled under crystal chandeliers, every flower petal placed with military precision. Vivian sat at the head of the table, wearing white, her smile rehearsed. Daniel hovered near her, eager, nervous. Emily looked drawn, her eyes flicking between us. Tessa, Vivian began, thank you for joining us. I think it's time we close this chapter, don't you? I returned her smile. That depends on what chapter you think we're in. A few guests chuckled politely, unsure whether it was a joke. Vivian's eyes hardened for half a second before softening again. I'm hosting a charity gala next week, she said smoothly. I'd like you to be there. It will be good for Daniel's standing and for the family's image. I wouldn't miss it, I said. The rest of the meal passed in carefully measured conversation. Vivian spoke about her foundation, her projects, her donors. Words wrapped in benevolence but steeped in control. I listened quietly, watching how Daniel's shoulders straightened every time she praised him. He wanted so badly to belong, and she knew it. After dessert, I excused myself and stepped out onto the terrace. Olivia was there, arranging flowers near the railing. Her posture was too careful to be casual. I approached her and handed her a folded piece of paper. Give this to Mark when he comes by this afternoon, I whispered. She nodded, slipping it into her pocket. Be careful, she murmured. I always am, I said, though I knew careful wasn't the same as safe. That afternoon, Mark called. I went through more of the files, he said. You were right, it's worse than we thought. She's been moving donor money into dummy charities under her own name. I've traced nearly $500,000 rerouted in the last 6 months. And Daniel? I asked. Still clean, technically, but his signatures are everywhere. She's using him as her shield. I took a deep breath. Then we'll have to make sure the shield turns into a mirror. Mark hesitated. You plan on confronting her? I plan on letting her confront herself, I said. The next day, I drove to Mark's office. He had printed copies of the key transactions and laid them across the desk. Numbers and dates lined the pages, precise and cold. Beside them, he placed a small audio recorder. Olivia managed to send this, he said. It's a call between Vivian and Mr. Tate discussing how to disguise the transfers as consulting fees. He pressed play. Vivian's voice came through, smooth and commanding. Make sure Daniel's name is on every document. It looks cleaner that way. No one questions a devoted son-in-law. Mr. Tate's reply was muffled but clear enough. And the missing sums? Reallocate them under international outreach, she said. Everyone loves a cause they can't verify. The room felt colder when the recording ended. Mark leaned back, rubbing his temples. This is enough to bury her. No, I said. It's enough for her to bury herself. We just have to give her a stage. He looked at me curiously. The gala? I nodded. She wants an apology. I'll give her one. Back home, I spent the evening sorting through copies of the documents. Each line felt like a confession written in ink. I labeled them carefully and placed them in a slim folder marked Harland Hope. When I closed it, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even satisfaction, but certainty. As night fell, I walked out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of wet grass. Across the street, the neighbor's wind chimes stirred softly. I thought of Robert and the quiet confidence he carried through life. He used to tell me, "You don't need to raise your voice when truth's on your side. Just wait. People will hear it in the silence." Inside, the phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice trembled slightly. "Tessa, I think something's wrong with Daniel. He's been distant, distracted. I heard him arguing with Mother about the accounts." My pulse quickened. What did she say? She told him to trust her, that he wouldn't understand the complexities of business. He looked scared. "Thank you for telling me, Emily," I said gently. "You did the right thing." After I hung up, I took the folder and slipped it into my handbag. The clock ticked on the mantel, steady and patient. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The rustle of curtains, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the night wind. When I finally went to bed, I left the lamp on. I wanted the light to stay, because sometimes darkness isn't the absence of truth. It's what truth waits behind, gathering strength. I closed my eyes and pictured the gala. Chandeliers, cameras, applause, Vivian glowing under the illusion of control. She'd hand me a microphone expecting submission, not knowing I'd already handed her the rope she'd tied herself with. The blue scarf hung over the chair across the room, catching the lamplight. I whispered, "Soon." 2 days before the gala, Daniel showed up unannounced. I was trimming the jasmine near the porch when his car pulled up, sleek and spotless, like everything else he had borrowed from someone else's world. He stepped out, his expression a mix of fatigue and defiance. The air between us felt heavy, like a bridge about to buckle under its own weight. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. I wiped my hands on my apron and nodded toward the porch. "Come inside." He followed me to the kitchen, where the kettle was already hissing. I poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. His eyes darted toward the blue scarf around my neck. "You're still wearing that old thing?" he said. "It reminds me who I am," I replied. He gave a humorless laugh. "You always say things like that. It's exhausting sometimes, you know." "I imagine integrity must be," I said gently. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, Vivian told me about this nonsense with the charity. You've been talking to people, asking questions you shouldn't." "Shouldn't?" I repeated. "Or that she doesn't want me to." "Do you realize how dangerous it is to spread rumors about her?" His voice was rising now, frustration dripping from each word. "She's been nothing but generous to you, to all of us. And you just can't stop picking at things." I met his eyes. "Daniel, have you looked at the foundation's reports yourself?" He froze for a moment. "She handles the big stuff. I just sign off on the operational approvals. Why?" "Because your name is on things you might not understand," I said. "You're smart enough to see when something doesn't add up. You just don't want to." He slammed the teacup onto the table. "You think I'm stupid? That's what this is about, isn't it? You've always thought you were the only one who saw the world clearly." "I don't think you're stupid," I said quietly. "I think you're afraid." His face reddened. "Afraid of what?" "Of disappointing her. Of losing the comfort she built around you. Of realizing that love built on control isn't love at all." He laughed bitterly. "You're unbelievable. You can't stand that I'm finally successful, that someone like Vivian actually believes in me." I took a slow breath. "What does your clock sound like, Daniel?" He frowned. "What?" "The watch on your wrist. What sound does it make?" He stared at me confused. "You've lost it." "No," I said, my voice steady. "It ticks like this." I tapped the table gently. "Every second is a reminder. Tick, she owns your time. Tick, she buys your silence. Tick, she rewrites your worth." "Stop it," he said sharply. "Tick," I whispered again. That's the sound of debt disguised as gratitude. For a moment, the kitchen fell utterly silent except for the faint ticking of his watch. His shoulders slumped, his hand trembling slightly. Then his face hardened again. Vivian warned me this would happen, he said. She said you'd try to turn me against her. She's very good at predicting reactions she's already planted, I said softly. He stood abruptly. You need help, Mom. Seriously. You're paranoid. You're letting your grief twist everything into some kind of moral war. I didn't stop him when he stormed toward the door. Daniel, I called as he reached for the handle. He paused, his back still turned. When all this comes to light, remember this moment. Remember that I asked you to look, not to choose sides. He hesitated for half a heartbeat, then left without another word. The silence that followed was almost comforting. I set his untouched cup aside and poured myself another, watching the steam curl upward. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, sweet and sad. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. Can I come by? I need to talk. When she arrived, her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clutching her purse as if it could hold her together. I poured her tea too, and she stared into the cup for a long time before speaking. I heard what happened, she said quietly. Daniel's upset, but there's something you need to know. I waited. Mother's been panicking. I overheard her on the phone with Mr. Tate last night. She told him to clean up the transfers before the gala. She said if anyone found out, she'd make sure Daniel took the fall. My stomach tightened, but I kept my tone calm. And you believe her? Tears welled in her eyes. I don't want to, but she's been different lately, paranoid, angry. She keeps saying things like, family is leverage. Then she's afraid, I said. And fear always exposes truth faster than guilt does. Emily looked at me, her voice trembling. What are you going to do? I'm going to do exactly what she asked, I said. I'll apologize, publicly. Her brow furrowed. But that'll make it worse. She'll humiliate you again. Maybe, I said softly. But this time, her stage will turn into her confession. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. I should have stopped her years ago. She told me once that silence keeps things beautiful. I thought she meant dignity. Now I think she meant control. I reached across the table and took her hand. Then maybe it's time we let silence tell the truth instead. We sat there for a long while, two women joined by pain that wasn't loud but deep. When Emily left, I walked to the window. The late afternoon light had turned golden, bathing the garden in warmth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled, soft and low. I went to my desk and opened the folder Mark had given me. Pages of numbers, signatures, and transactions stared back. I slipped the recorder beside them and closed the cover. Tomorrow, Mark would deliver copies to a journalist he trusted, quietly, anonymously. I tied my blue scarf tighter, feeling the fabric cool against my neck. My reflection in the glass looked calm, but my pulse was steady with purpose. As night settled, the phone rang again. This time, it was Olivia. Her voice was hushed. Mrs. Moore, I think she knows. She's been making calls all evening. Be careful tomorrow. I will, I said. And Olivia, thank you. When the call ended, I sat alone, the house dark except for the faint glow of the lamp. The clock ticked steadily in the background, the sound no longer a warning but a countdown. I whispered into the quiet. Let her think she's won. The truth's already dressed and waiting for the party. The envelope arrived the next morning, thick and embossed with gold trim, like something meant to impress rather than invite. I found it waiting on my doorstep, resting beside the morning paper as if it had simply fallen from the sky. Inside, on creamy parchment, Vivian's handwriting looped in perfect cursive. For the sake of family unity and grace, I invite you to join me as an honored guest at the Harlan Hope Charity Gala. A public apology will restore our peace. It was the word restore that made me smile. Vivian didn't want peace. She wanted proof of control. Still, I tucked the invitation into my purse. The stage she'd built would serve both of us. That afternoon, I called Mark. "She's setting up her own ending," I said. He chuckled softly. "You always had a knack for poetic justice. Everything's ready. The files are secure, and the journalist confirmed the drop. Olivia's also made a backup copy. She's braver than most people I know." "She's brave because she's tired," I said. "And tired people don't stay silent forever." Before hanging up, he asked, "You sure you're ready for this?" "I've been ready since the night my son told me to apologize," I said. Later that day, Emily came by unannounced. Her eyes were red again, but her posture had changed. Less fragile, more determined. She sat on the edge of my couch and handed me something small. Daniel's Rolex. The watch gleamed in her palm, motionless. Its ticking stopped. "He left it on the table this morning," she said. "He said he doesn't want reminders anymore." I took it carefully, feeling its weight. "Sometimes the silence after the ticking is the sound of freedom," I said. "I don't know if he's ready to face what's coming," she whispered. "He doesn't have to yet," I told her. "He just needs to remember who's standing beside him when it does." As she left, the sun dipped behind the oak trees, turning the light soft and amber. I stood at the window, turning the watch over in my hand. Time had stopped for Daniel, but for Vivian, it was about to run out. The day of the gala came wrapped in a strange stillness. Savannah glittered that evening. Every socialite, donor, and politician seemed to find their way to Vivian's mansion. Cars lined the long driveway again, but this time I parked closer, near the edge of the lawn where the magnolias bloomed. I stepped out, my heels crunching against the gravel. The air smelled of champagne and expectation. The mansion glowed from every window, its light spilling onto the gardens like a declaration of wealth. I adjusted the blue scarf around my neck, the fabric catching the evening breeze. At the entrance, a young attendant took my name and smiled politely. "Mrs. Moore, welcome. Mrs. Harlan is expecting you." Inside, the ballroom looked like a painting. Crystal chandeliers, strings of violins, women in sequined gowns that caught the light like scales. The hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the soft clink of glasses. Vivian stood near the grand staircase, radiant in silver, greeting guests with her signature charm. She turned as I approached, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Tessa," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "You came. How lovely." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, looking paler than usual, his smile forced. Emily hovered near the buffet table, her hands clasped, watching everything. Olivia was moving through the crowd with trays of drinks, her eyes finding mine just once. A small nod, almost imperceptible. Somewhere near the back of the room, I spotted Mark in his simple black suit, pretending to check his phone. Vivian took my hand and squeezed it lightly, her tone just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm glad we can finally put all unpleasantness behind us. Let's show everyone what real grace looks like." "Yes," I said, holding her gaze. "Let's." Dinner was a performance. Every toast, Every laugh, every polite murmur was choreographed. Vivian spoke about philanthropy and unity, her words dripping with false humility. The audience ate it up. Daniel nodded along like a man hypnotized. Halfway through the evening, a stagehand whispered something in Vivian's ear. She smiled and rose from her seat. "Friends," she said into the microphone, "tonight isn't just about charity. It's about forgiveness. We're blessed to have family who remind us of humility. Tessa Moore has graciously agreed to say a few words." The crowd turned. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. My heart beat steady, not fast. I could hear the faint buzz of the projector in the back, the quiet hum of something waiting to begin. Vivian handed me the microphone, her fingers brushing mine with mock gentleness. "I know this isn't easy," she said sweetly, "but it's the right thing." I nodded. Yes, the right thing. I stood at the center of the stage, the lights soft and golden. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, just long enough for curiosity to fill the room. Then I began, my voice calm and steady. "I came here tonight because I was asked to apologize. So, let me begin there. I'm sorry for believing that money could buy morals. I'm sorry for mistaking silence for respect. And I'm sorry for assuming everyone in this room already knew the difference between charity and theft." A ripple passed through the guests, murmurs rising like wind through leaves. Vivian froze, her smile cracking slightly. I continued, my voice unwavering. "They say the truth always finds its way home. Sometimes it just needs a microphone." Behind me, a soft click echoed. On the projector screen, an image appeared. Vivian's own signature on falsified donation forms, followed by audio of her conversation with Mr. Tate. Her voice filled the room, unmistakable. "Make sure Daniel's name is on every document. It looks cleaner that way." Gasps filled the air. Cameras flashed. Vivian reached for the microphone, but Emily was already there, her hand gripping it tightly. "No, Mother," she said quietly. "You've spoken enough." Daniel sat frozen, his head in his hands. Olivia stepped back from the equipment, her face pale but resolute. Mark watched from the corner, his expression unreadable. Vivian's voice trembled now. "How dare you? How dare you?" I looked at her gently. "You asked for an apology. You just didn't expect it to tell the truth." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't fade. It stays stretching over the broken sound of pride unraveling. Somewhere behind me, the screen flickered off, leaving only the reflection of the chandelier swaying above. Vivian stumbled back, her voice lost. The guests whispered, already turning their eyes elsewhere. The illusion had cracked, and nothing glitters quite the same once it breaks. I stepped down from the stage, passing her without another word. My scarf brushed her arm lightly as I walked by. She flinched as if it burned. Outside, the air was cool and clean, the stars sharp above the dark trees. I could still hear faint echoes of the crowd behind me, the way disbelief turns quickly to judgment. I stood beside my car for a long moment, breathing. The ticking of Daniel's watch in my purse started again somehow, steady, alive. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The night of the gala will live in Savannah's memory for years, not because of the glitter or the champagne, but because silence itself became the loudest sound in the room. I didn't plan the drama that followed. I only planned the truth. The rest happened because arrogance always mistakes quiet for weakness. When I walked into that ballroom, the air had been heavy with perfume and pride. By the time I left, it smelled of fear. The moment after the screen went black stretched long and heavy. The guests, society's finest, dressed like mirrors, sat in stunned stillness, unsure whether to breathe or clap or flee. Vivian's face, pale beneath the chandelier's golden light, looked carved from porcelain about to shatter. "Turn that off!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Who did this?" No one moved. Cameras clicked. Phones began recording. The same guests who'd laughed with her now avoided her eyes. Emily stood frozen beside the stage, tears glistening but unfallen. Daniel, poor Daniel, had his head bowed like a man at confession. I stayed exactly where I was, the microphone still in my hand. "It's already off," I said softly. "Now everyone can hear the silence you taught us to keep." Vivian turned toward me, her face twisting. "You think this makes you noble? You think humiliating me in front of donors helps anyone?" "I think it reminds people what real charity means," I replied. The ballroom erupted in low whispers, the kind that spread faster than truth itself. Reporters edged forward, phones lifted. One of them asked, "Mrs. Harland, is it true these transfers were falsified?" Vivian stepped back on her heels, scraping the marble floor. "This is nonsense. Fabricated. My accountant will—" But Olivia, standing by the projector, spoke up for the first time. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "I worked for you for 20 years. I kept your secrets. I saw the money moved, the donations forged. The children's hospital you promised never received a cent." A collective gasp filled the room. Even the violins had stopped mid-note. The silence sharp as glass. Vivian's gaze darted wildly across the faces around her, searching for loyalty. "Daniel," she said suddenly, reaching toward him, her voice pleading now. Tell them I did this for all of us, for the family." Daniel lifted his head slowly. His face was ashen. "You used me," he whispered. "You used my name to cover your greed." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I made you powerful." He stood, his voice trembling but clear. "You made me ashamed." That was the moment the room shifted, not loudly, but like a tide turning. The illusion of control dissolved in front of everyone. Vivian swayed slightly, her breath uneven. "I built this city's faith in me," she said, her words breaking. "You can't destroy that in one night." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "I didn't destroy it, Vivian. You did. I just turned on the lights." Her eyes filled with something that wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief, the kind that comes when a person finally meets themselves. Security approached gently as cameras flashed. Emily moved to Daniel's side, slipping her hand into his. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull away either. Reporters swarmed the stage, their questions sharp and hungry. "Will you step down from your foundation, Mrs. Harland? Is it true your son-in-law was unknowingly involved? How long has this been going on?" Vivian's lips moved, but no words came. For a woman who'd always controlled every room she entered, silence was the cruelest punishment. I placed the microphone on the podium. "Thank you for your time," I said simply, and stepped away. As I walked past the rows of tables, people parted quietly, as if making space for something sacred. I could feel their eyes on me, not in pity, but in recognition. They saw not revenge, but balance. Outside, the night air felt crisp and alive. The noise of the city seemed distant, replaced by the softer rhythm of wind through the magnolias. I stood by the fountain, looking back at the mansion that glowed like a lantern losing its flame. A few moments later, Emily found me. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I said. "Truth did." She looked back toward the mansion. "They're questioning her already. The press will tear her apart." "Let them ask," I said. "She's been answering to no one for too long." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't stop her sooner." I reached for her hand. "You stopped her tonight. That's what matters." A car pulled up near the drive. Mark's. He got out, holding a folder under his arm. "The files are in safe hands now," he said. "The journalists already sent them to federal investigators. You won't have to lift another finger." "Good," I said. "Justice doesn't need my voice anymore." He smiled faintly. "You've done something rare, Tessa. You made silence do the talking." As he left, I turned toward the fountain again. My reflection rippled on the surface, distorted but peaceful. Somewhere inside the mansion, voices rose. Panic, orders, denial. And somewhere else, Daniel was sitting alone, realizing that the ground beneath him had shifted for good. I touched the blue scarf lightly. Robert's words echoed in my memory. "Wear something that reminds you who you are." The stars were brighter that night than they'd been in months. I drove home with the windows down, letting the cool air carry the scent of pine and salt from the river. When I reached my house, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the doorway, letting the darkness settle around me. It felt different now. Not a shadow, but a shelter. On the table, Daniel's watch still lay where I'd left it. I picked it up and listened. It had started ticking again, soft but steady, like a heart forgiving itself. I smiled, placed it beside Robert's letter, and whispered, "Time finally learned whose hands it belongs in." The night outside was quiet, almost reverent. Somewhere far away, headlines were being written, reputations were crumbling, and truth was finding its audience. But here, in my small house, all was still. Tomorrow, there would be fallout, investigations, news stories. But tonight, there was peace. The kind that doesn't announce itself but sits quietly, knowing it has nothing left to prove. Morning came like a whisper after a storm. The news spread before the sun had fully risen, carried by the soft hum of phones, the rustle of newspapers, and the endless churn of social media. Vivian Harlan's name was everywhere, no longer followed by words like philanthropist or icon, but by fraud, investigation, and federal inquiry. I sat at the kitchen table, my cup of tea cooling beside me, the paper open to a front-page photo of her standing outside her mansion. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. The headline read, "Charity Queen Accused of Misusing Funds." I didn't feel triumphant. The human part of me, the teacher, the mother, the widow, felt only quiet sadness. No one truly wins in a war against deceit. There are only those who learn and those who don't. The phone rang mid-morning. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as Daniel's voice filled the room. "Mom, I don't know what to say. They've frozen the accounts. The investigators called me in. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." His breath caught on the line. "Emily's packing her things. Reporters are outside our door. I need to see you." I replayed the message twice before calling him back. His voice was raw when he answered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. "I know," I replied. "Come here." He arrived an hour later, unshaven and pale, his suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. The Rolex was gone from his wrist, a faint tan line marking where it used to sit. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if he should step inside. "Come in, Daniel," I said softly. "You look exhausted." He nodded. his eyes glassy. Everything's falling apart. They say she could face prison time. And me. Sit down, I said gently. He sank into the chair across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock, steady and merciful. Finally, he whispered, "Were you behind it? The files, the recording, all of it?" I met his eyes. Truth doesn't belong to anyone, Daniel. It just waits for someone brave enough to speak it. He rubbed his hands over his face. She said I'd be untouchable, that she'd protect me. I believed her. God, I believed everything. You believed what you needed to, I said. We all do until we can't anymore. His voice broke. I should have listened to you. You tried to warn me. I reached across the table, resting my hand on his. You were trying to build something. You just built it on borrowed ground. He looked at me then, really looked. And I saw the boy I used to know flicker behind the man he'd become. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said. We wait for the noise to fade. He frowned slightly. That's all? Yes, I said. Because once the noise dies, truth keeps working in silence. We sat like that for a long time. When he finally left, I watched him walk to his car with slower steps, as if each one carried both regret and relief. That afternoon, I drove into town. Everywhere I went, people were talking about Vivian Harland. Her mansion was under investigation, her foundation offices closed, her name removed from charity boards. The same people who once clung to her now whispered about how they had always suspected something. I stopped at a cafe near the river and ordered a cup of black coffee. The television above the counter showed news footage, Vivian being escorted from her home, flanked by lawyers. For a moment, I thought she looked older, almost fragile. Fame had melted away, leaving something small and human. When I returned home, the answering machine blinked again. Another message. This time it was from Olivia. Mrs. Moore, the authorities came by today. They asked about the files. I told them the truth. Thank you for letting me be brave. Her voice trembled on the last words, and I smiled faintly. Courage often sounds like fear before it settles. As evening fell, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window. The house across the street had its porch light on, casting a warm glow over the quiet road. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly before fading. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't surprised. Daniel stood there again, but this time Emily was with him. She carried a small paper bag in her hands. Mom, Emily said softly, we brought something. Inside the bag was a simple box of chamomile tea and a note written in her handwriting, for quiet nights after loud days. Thank you, I said, placing it on the counter. Emily hesitated. I know you didn't do this to hurt her. No, I said. I did it so she'd finally see herself. Daniel nodded slowly. You were right. About everything. I wasn't right, I said. I was patient. We sat together for a while, the three of us, surrounded by the smell of tea and the hum of the evening. No grand apologies, no long speeches, just the simple act of breathing in the same quiet space again. When they left, I stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and clean, the stars soft behind thin clouds. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of waiting. I thought about Vivian, sitting somewhere behind closed doors, maybe realizing that control is a kind of prison that doesn't need bars. Maybe she'd remember the words I'd said at the gala. That truth always finds its way home. I whispered into the night. Let it find her too. The garden lights flickered gently, the magnolias swaying in the breeze. I went back inside, leaving the door open for the sound of crickets and the rhythm of peace returning. I poured the new chamomile tea and let it steep. The clock ticked in its familiar way, no longer a countdown, but a heartbeat of calm. I sat by the window, my hands wrapped around the warm cup, and thought about how endings rarely arrive with thunder. Sometimes they just exhale. 2 weeks after the gala, the mansion on Harlan Hill went dark. It happened quietly, almost politely. One day the lights were burning in every window, and the next, only silence and shadows remained. The newspaper said the federal investigation had moved forward, that the Harlan Hope Foundation's accounts were frozen, and that Vivian was cooperating under severe emotional strain. I drove past the estate that morning. The iron gates stood open, a sign taped to the pillar that read, "Property under federal custody." The once immaculate lawn had already begun to yellow. Gardeners and housekeepers were gone. Even the marble fountain had stopped running. The mansion looked like a photograph someone had left out in the rain, its beauty intact, but fading at the edges. I parked across the road for a moment, just watching. It was strange, how still it seemed. I thought of all the nights that house had glowed like a crown over the city, and how that glow had been fed by other people's light. When the truth finally arrived, it had simply turned off the power. I didn't stay long. The quiet was too loud. That afternoon, Mark stopped by my house. He looked tired but satisfied, a man who'd seen the end of a long puzzle. "It's official," he said, setting a thick envelope on my table. "The Department of Justice has opened a full case. Vivian will likely face charges for embezzlement and tax fraud. The board resigned this morning." "And Daniel?" I asked. "DDT. Aunt." "They cleared him. The investigators confirmed he didn't know what he was signing. He'll have to testify, but he's free." I nodded, relief passing through me like air after a storm. "And the others?" "Olivia's protected under whistleblower provisions," Mark said. "She's safe." The journalist published a follow-up this morning, calls it "The Cost of Silent Generosity." "You should read it." I smiled faintly. "I don't need to. I lived it." Mark studied me for a moment, then opened the envelope and slid a small object across the table. It was Daniel's watch. "He asked me to bring this back to you, said it doesn't feel like his anymore." I picked it up, feeling the cool weight in my hand. The ticking had stopped again. I set it on the table beside my tea, where it caught the late sunlight. "Maybe it's finally resting," I said. Mark chuckled. "Or maybe it's waiting to start again." We shared a quiet moment before he stood to leave. "You did something good, Tessa. Don't let anyone call it revenge. It was truth. That's rarer." After he left, I took the watch and placed it in the wooden box with Robert's letter and my scarf. The three together looked like a still life painting, time, memory, and dignity sharing the same frame. The phone rang later that evening. It was Emily. Her voice was soft but steadier now. "Vivian's been served," she said. "Her lawyers advised her to settle, but she refused. She says she wants to tell her side." "She always did love her side," I replied. "She keeps the curtains closed all day," Emily continued. "I went by this morning to drop off some documents for the investigators. The house feels dead." "Some houses die when truth moves in," I said. Emily hesitated. "She asked about you." "Oh?" "She wanted to know if you were satisfied." I took a slow breath. No one should be satisfied when a family collapses, Emily. But I am at peace. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched dusk stretch across the sky. The magnolias had begun to bloom again. The first night of spring carried a scent that reminded me of Robert's cologne and freshly painted classrooms, the scent of beginnings disguised as endings. On the coffee table lay the newspaper Mark had brought. The headline read, "Harlan Foundation Fraud. Former Director under Federal Review." Beneath it, a smaller line caught my eye. Sources confirm evidence provided anonymously to authorities ensured case integrity. Anonymous. I smiled. The truth didn't need a name. That night, I dreamed of light returning to places that had forgotten what honesty felt like. I dreamed of Daniel as a boy, chasing fireflies in the backyard, his laughter free and unmeasured. When I woke, the air felt lighter. I made coffee and opened the curtains wide. The sun spilled in, landing on the scarf still draped over the chair. The blue had deepened somehow, as though it had absorbed every shade of what had passed. Around noon, Daniel came by. He looked calmer than before, dressed simply, no trace of the man who once tried to measure his worth in Rolex ticks. "They've called off the reporters," he said. The question stopped. "Good," I replied. "Let quiet finish what noise began." He smiled faintly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," I said. "By waking up." He sat down and pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. "I've been writing a letter to Vivian. I don't know if I'll send it yet." "Sometimes writing is enough," I said. He looked around the house, his gaze soft. "It's peaceful here. I forgot what that feels like." "Peace isn't quiet," I told him. "It's the sound of truth not needing an audience." He nodded slowly. "I want to build something honest now. Maybe teach again. Emily thinks we should start over somewhere small." I reached over and touched his hand. Small things grow stronger roots. When he left, I stepped outside and watched his car disappear down the street. The wind carried the faint hum of early evening. Somewhere far off, church bells began to ring, slow and measured. I turned back toward the house, pausing by the porch railing. Across the way, the old magnolia tree caught the sunset, its leaves glowing gold. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth against my skin. Behind me, inside the quiet house, the watch ticked once, a faint sound, but steady, and I realized then that the story wasn't about endings at all. It was about lights turning off so that others could see the stars. The letter came 3 weeks later, hand-delivered by a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd been trained never to make eye contact. He said he was from the attorney's office and left before I could offer him a cup of tea. Inside the envelope, written in neat, elegant script, were 4 words: "She wishes to see you." For a moment, I just stared at them. I wasn't sure what to feel: curiosity, reluctance, or something deeper, quieter. I folded the paper and placed it on the table beside the scarf. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window made the blue fabric glow, soft and patient. By the end of the day, I'd made up my mind. There are conversations that don't belong to the living or the dead, but to the space between. Unfinished things that need to be seen, not for closure, but for truth's sake. The following morning, I drove to the detention center an hour outside the city. The road was long and empty, the landscape washed in gray. I brought no purse, no makeup, only the scarf, neatly wrapped around my neck, and the calm of a woman who had already lived through every storm that words could summon. The building rose out of the field like a concrete shadow. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and something metallic, like rain trapped in a cage. The guards were polite but detached. They scanned my ID, led me through a series of gates, and into a small visiting room with a glass divider. When she entered, I almost didn't recognize her. Vivian Harland, once the queen of Savannah society, looked smaller somehow. Her perfect posture slouched, her hair stripped of its color, her elegance reduced to a plain beige jumpsuit. But her eyes were still sharp, though the fire behind them had dimmed. She sat down across from me, the phone pressed against her ear. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt like a living thing pacing between us. "Tessa," she said finally, her voice low, brittle. "You look the same." "So do you," I said softly. "Only smaller." Her mouth curved into something between a smirk and a grimace. "I suppose congratulations are in order. You got what you wanted." "I didn't want this," I replied. "I wanted the truth." She leaned closer to the glass. "The truth is overrated. People don't want it. They just want stories that make them feel moral." "Then why write to me?" Her eyes wavered for the first time. "Because I wanted to see what victory looks like." "This isn't victory," I said. "It's consequence." She laughed quietly, a sound without warmth. "Consequence. Such a noble word for destruction." I studied her face carefully. Destruction is what happens when you keep building higher after the foundation cracks. I didn't destroy you, Vivian. You built this. Her hand tightened around the receiver. "You think you're better than me, but we're the same. You and I. We both wanted control. You just hid yours behind dignity." I shook my head. "No, dignity isn't a disguise. It's what's left when you stop pretending." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, "I never hated you, you know. I envied you. Daniel loved you for your quiet. People listened to you without fear. I had to buy every pair of ears that ever turned my way." That admission hung between us, fragile as breath. I saw, just for a second, the woman behind the performance, the girl who had clawed her way into a world that only loved her reflection. "Why now?" I asked softly. "Why tell me this?" She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her paper visitor pass. "Because I can't sleep. Because every time the lights go out here, I hear your voice in that ballroom. I'm sorry for believing money could buy morals." She lifted her eyes again, and for the first time, they weren't defensive. They were raw. "Did you enjoy it? Watching me fall?" I took a deep breath. "No, I didn't enjoy it. But I respected it. It was the first honest moment you'd ever given anyone." Her lips trembled, and for a second, I thought she might cry. "You ruined everything I built." "No," I said quietly. "You finally stopped lying to it." A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the fluorescent light. She didn't wipe it away. "I don't know who I am without it." I leaned forward until the glass reflected both our faces side by side. Two women bound by age, pride, and the weight of choices. "Then maybe that's your beginning," I said. The guard signaled that time was up. She looked at me as if trying to memorize the moment, like a painter studying her own unfinished work. As I stood to leave, she whispered, barely audible through the phone, "Was it worth it?" I paused at the door. It wasn't about worth. It was about weight, and some things you can't carry forever. Outside, the sky was wide and colorless. I stood in the parking lot for a while, the scarf lifting slightly in the wind. Behind me, the gates clanged shut, the sound echoing like an exhale. Through the chain-link fence, I could still see her silhouette, small and still. For the first time, she looked human, not a queen, not a fraud, just a woman who'd spent her whole life chasing validation and finally ran out of mirrors. Daniel was waiting in his car near the road. He didn't say anything as I got in, just reached over and squeezed my hand. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "How was she?" "Honest," I said. "Finally." We drove in silence for a while, the road unfurling like a long sigh beneath us. Fields of wild grass swayed on either side, golden under the fading sun. At a red light, Daniel glanced at me. "Do you regret any of it?" I looked out the window, the wind tugging gently at the edge of my scarf. "No. Regret belongs to those who never spoke when they should have." When we reached home, he hugged me before getting back in his car. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting truth do the talking." After he left, I stood on the porch watching his taillights fade. The world felt lighter somehow. Not because justice had been served, but because something false had finally stopped breathing. I went inside and placed my hand over the scarf, still warm from the sun. "Rest now," I whispered. "We've done enough." And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. The weeks after my visit to Vivian passed with an unusual quiet, not the hollow silence of waiting, but the kind that follows a long piece of music. Soft, lingering, and full. The investigation had wound down. The papers had moved on to new scandals, new names. Life, as it always does, shifted its focus elsewhere. Daniel called more often now, never to talk about the past, but about small things. The garden, the weather, the classes he was teaching again at the community school. Sometimes he came by in the evenings, carrying groceries or a new book he thought I'd like. Each time, he looked a little more like himself. One late afternoon, as the light turned golden over the magnolia tree, I found him sitting on the porch steps, his elbows on his knees, staring out at the street. I brought 2 cups of tea and joined him. "Emily's been volunteering at the shelter," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She says it helps her sleep." "That's good," I said. "Sometimes peace grows best in borrowed soil." He smiled faintly, looking down at his cup. "You always talk like that, like every sentence is hiding something wiser behind it." "Maybe it is," I said, and he laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. For a long while, we just sat there, the sound of the wind threading through the magnolia leaves. Then his voice grew quieter. "I saw her." I turned. "Vivian?" He nodded. "They allowed me a short visit after her hearing. She looks older. She said you came to see her." "Yes," I said. "She asked to see me." He swallowed. "Did she say anything about me?" I hesitated, then met his eyes. "She said she envied you, that you were loved for being gentle in a world that rewards noise." He looked away, blinking hard. "She never told me that." "She couldn't," I said. "Pride doesn't know how to speak kindness." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "She asked me to forgive her." "And will you?" He looked out at the sky. "I already have. Not because she deserves it, but because I need to remember I'm not her." The truth of that sentence hung between us like a small bell still ringing. I reached out and touched his arm. "That's all forgiveness really is, Daniel. Letting go before it turns you into what you escaped." He nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. "You know, for a while I thought I'd ruined your life. I was so sure that what I did at that gala, believing her, defending her, would break us forever." "You didn't break me," I said softly. "You just reminded me why I had to stand." He turned to me then, his face open, stripped of guilt, of pride, of everything that had kept us apart. I'm sorry, Mom, for every word I didn't say, for every time I made you feel small to make her feel big. I smiled and reached for his hand. You were lost. It happens. Some people wander to find themselves, others to forget. I think you were doing both. He laughed quietly, brushing his sleeve across his eyes. You always make things sound easier than they were. They weren't easy, I said, but they're done, and that's enough. Emily arrived a little later, carrying a basket of warm muffins. She'd grown softer around the edges too, like a painting that time had mellowed. When she stepped onto the porch, Daniel stood and pulled her close. She looked at me, tentative at first, then smiled. I brought these for you, she said. And something else. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay her wedding ring, the same one that once symbolized her mother's control. I don't want to keep anything that came from that place, she said. It was bought with silence. I looked at the ring resting in her palm. What do you want to do with it? She hesitated. Maybe you should decide. I shook my head. No, you should. You earned the choice. She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. There's a donation box at the shelter. I think I'll leave it there. Let it become something that actually helps someone. Good, I said. Turn what hurt you into something kind. That's the only real inheritance worth leaving. We sat together on the porch, eating muffins and watching the light fade. Emily leaned against Daniel's shoulder, and for the first time, they looked at peace. Two people finally stepping out from under someone else's shadow. As the sun dipped lower, I stood and went inside. On the table, the blue scarf hung from the back of my chair, its folds catching the last of the day's light. I lifted it gently and draped it over the porch railing. The breeze caught it, letting it flutter softly, like breath. Daniel watched me, smiling. You still wear that thing everywhere. It reminds me of your father, I said, and of who I promised to be when he was gone. He nodded. I remember him wearing that same calm you have now. He never raised his voice, even when I deserved it. He believed peace taught better lessons than anger, I said. Daniel looked at me thoughtfully. You're both the same that way, strong without needing to prove it. I felt tears rise, but didn't hide them. Then maybe we did something right after all. The last rays of sunlight spilled across the yard, painting everything gold. I could hear children laughing somewhere down the street, the sound of ordinary life going on, simple, beautiful, real. Emily took Daniel's hand. Come on, she said softly. Let's go. We'll come by again this weekend. He kissed my cheek before they left. I love you, Mom. I love you too, I said. More for who you're becoming than who you were. When their car disappeared around the corner, I turned back toward the porch. The blue scarf rippled lightly in the breeze, the golden light wrapping it in warmth. The air smelled of tea and magnolia and something sweeter, something like healing. I sat there for a long while, the world quiet except for the hum of crickets and the heartbeat of time moving forward. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to hold on to the past. It was safe now, folded into memory, resting where it belonged. And as the first stars appeared, I whispered into the dusk, "Thank you, Robert. The lesson's finished." The scarf fluttered once more, as if answering. 1 year later, the house had changed. Not in structure, but in soul. The walls that once held silence like a secret now carried warmth. The garden outside had grown wild with jasmine, and each morning, Sunlight poured through the kitchen window like forgiveness finding its way home. I woke earlier these days, not because of habit or loneliness, but because peace had a rhythm all its own. The kettle whistled softly as I brewed tea, the same kind Emily and Daniel had brought me months before, chamomile, gentle and floral. On the counter sat a small pile of envelopes, each one a thank you letter from the women in my art class at the community center. I taught there twice a week now. Widows, retirees, women who'd once forgotten their voices and were learning to draw them again. As I cleaned my brushes that morning, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window, I saw Daniel's car pulling into the drive, sunlight glinting off its hood. Emily stepped out first, carrying a basket, and then Daniel followed, holding a small child, my grandson, Henry, named after my late husband. The sight still caught me off guard every time, like a quiet miracle repeating itself. When they reached the porch, I opened the door before they could knock. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel said, smiling. "We brought company." Henry reached out for me with both hands, babbling happily. I lifted him, breathing in the soft scent of baby lotion and sunshine. "You've grown since last week," I said. Emily laughed. "He's eating everything in sight. I think he's got your husband's appetite." We settled in the living room, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. Daniel placed a small wrapped box on the coffee table. "Before you open it," he said, "there's something you should know. It's from her." I froze for a moment, my hands hovering over the box. "Vivian?" He nodded. "She sent it before her sentence began. She's serving 2 years. Maybe less with good behavior. The letter came through the attorney last week." Emily added softly. "She asked us to bring it when we felt the time was right." I looked at the box for a long while, then untied the string. Inside lay a single folded sheet of paper and a pendant. Small, silver, simple. The letter, written in her elegant hand, read, "Tessa, your apology was the only honest thing anyone ever gave me. I see now that grace isn't how you stand above others. It's how you kneel beside them. Tell Daniel I hope he teaches Henry to live that way. Vivian." I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then I set it down and felt a quiet, unexpected ache, something softer than resentment, heavier than relief. "She sounds different," Emily said carefully. "She sounds human," I replied. "And that's enough." Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that releases the last bit of something old. "Do you forgive her?" I smiled faintly. "I already did, the day she finally told the truth." We ate lunch together on the porch, passing plates of salad and cornbread, Henry giggling whenever the wind caught the napkins. The house seemed to hum with contentment, the kind that grows from endings done right. After they left, I walked through the rooms, tidying the spaces where life had collected itself. The scarf hung still on its hook by the door, faded a little now, but no less beautiful. I ran my fingers along the fabric, remembering the letter Robert had written all those years ago. Wear something that reminds you who you are. I tied it loosely around my neck before stepping outside. The air smelled of rain coming, the sky a deep silver blue. Across the street, my neighbor Clara waved from her garden, her hands stained with soil. "You heading to class, Tessa?" she called. "Yes," I said, smiling. "We're painting self-portraits today." "Well," she said, laughing, "you'll have the best model you know." At the community center, the women were already gathered around the long tables. Brushes clinked against jars, and the faint buzz of laughter filled the room. When they saw me, They greeted me with the warmth of old friends. "All right, ladies," I said, setting my bag down. "Today we paint truth, not faces. I want you to paint how you feel, not how you look." One of them, a quiet widow named Ruth, raised her hand. "What if what we feel isn't beautiful?" I smiled. "Then it's real, and that's better." They began painting, and for a while, the only sounds were strokes of brushes and the occasional soft sigh of focus. I moved between them, adjusting a line here, softening a shadow there. When I finally returned to my own easel, I began to paint something I hadn't dared to before. My home, my garden, my blue scarf hanging in the sunlight. In the corner of the canvas, I added a small figure, Robert, standing under the magnolia tree, smiling. When the class ended, Ruth came to me, her canvas in hand. She'd painted a house too, a small one, quiet but full of light. "I didn't think I had anything left to say," she whispered. "But I do now." I squeezed her hand gently. "We all do. Sometimes it just takes losing something loud to hear it." That evening, I returned home and placed my finished painting on the mantel. The light from the window touched the brushstrokes, bringing them to life. The mail sat on the table, and among it was a postcard. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was short. "Truth waits, and you made it speak. Olivia." I smiled, feeling tears rise in my eyes. The world had moved on, but its echoes were kind. As the sun set, Daniel and Emily came by again, this time with Henry toddling ahead of them, his tiny feet pattering across the wooden floor. His laughter filled the house like birdsong. When they left, I stayed on the porch, watching the evening turn gold. The magnolia tree shimmered in the soft light, and the blue scarf fluttered in the breeze. The world was quiet now, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it had finally said what mattered. I thought of Vivian, somewhere far away, serving her time. I hoped she'd found a small window of her own, where truth could reach her too. I thought of Robert, of his letter, of how the smallest acts, wearing a scarf, telling the truth, staying kind, can become the loudest legacy. And I thought of Daniel, of Emily, of Henry, 3 lives rebuilt not through victory, but through humility. As the first stars appeared, I whispered to the night, "It's never too late." Then I closed the door, the quiet house breathing around me, full of peace, memory, and something even gentler, dignity.